I think what gets me is how easily we get caught up in the daily grind. We forget to step back and ask the bigger questions like, how did we even get here? Or, is there more to life than this? It's almost as if we're on autopilot, just going through the motions without questioning the underlying reality.
It's like we're characters in a video game, simply following pre-programmed routines. We wake up, go to work, eat, sleep, repeat. But what if there's a whole other dimension beyond our limited perception, controlling the very fabric of our existence?
And that's precisely why we might never be able to definitively prove or disprove the simulation theory. If our reality is a construct, then the true nature of existence lies outside of it, beyond our ability to grasp. Just like a 2D video game character can't comprehend the 3D world it exists in, we might be fundamentally incapable of perceiving the true nature of our own reality.
You know, there's another aspect to this that I find fascinating. The idea that our perception of reality might be a kind of evolutionary fitness simulation, as you put it. It's almost as if our brains are constantly running simulations to predict outcomes and ensure our survival.
That's a really interesting point. And it makes me think about the limitations of our perception. We rely on our senses to interpret the world around us. But what if there's so much more that we simply can't detect?
And then there's the whole issue of infinity. Take pi, for example. It's an endless, non-repeating number. Now, imagine trying to simulate a universe where every sphere, every planet, every star contains this infinitely complex number. It seems like an incredible waste of processing power, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And that leads to the question, could the existence of such infinities point to the limitations of our 3D reality? Perhaps these numbers seem infinite because they extend beyond the dimensions we can perceive. Maybe there are higher dimensions where these numbers actually resolve or have a different meaning altogether.
In that sense, our 3D reality could be seen as a kind of simulation itself, a simplified version of a much grander and more complex reality that exists beyond our current understanding.
You know, some people argue against the simulation theory by pointing to the holographic principle, which suggests that our 3D reality is encoded on a 2D surface. But there are also arguments that the math doesn't quite add up, and the holographic principle might not be the whole story.
And there are others who simply reject the idea of a simulated reality because they see it as a way for people to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. They argue that focusing on the mundane motions of everyday life is a choice, and that attributing it to a simulation is a cop-out.
I see their point, but I also think it's important to remain open to possibilities. After all, there are many things about the universe that we still don't understand. And frankly, some technological advancements are starting to feel eerily close to what we might imagine in a simulated reality.
Look at the advancements in mind-reading technology, for example. The ability to record and even transmit thoughts is no longer science fiction. Imagine the potential for manipulation if someone could implant thoughts or create false memories. It's not a stretch to see how such technology could be used to gaslight individuals and make them question their own reality.
You know, there's another perspective on this whole simulation discussion that I find intriguing. The idea that our own consciousness might be the driving force behind the simulation.
So, instead of being part of a larger simulated reality, we are each simulating our own individual realities.
In a way, yes. Think about it. Our brains are constantly processing information from our senses and constructing a model of the world around us. This model, this internal simulation, is what we experience as reality.
After all, our brains are confined within our skulls with no direct access to the external world. We rely on our senses to provide us with data, and then our brains interpret that data to create a picture of what's out there.
So in essence, we are all living in our own unique simulations, constructed by our own minds. It's a fascinating way to think about consciousness and the nature of reality.
We need to distinguish between two different types of simulations here. One is the way our brains naturally construct a model of reality based on sensory input. This is a well-established scientific explanation for how we perceive the world.
But the simulation hypothesis goes beyond that. It proposes that our entire reality, including our brains and bodies, is a simulation running on some advanced computer in a higher dimensional universe.
So, the first type of simulation is a personal internal experience, while the second type is a universal external reality that encompasses everything we know.
And while the first type is readily explained by science, the second type remains a fascinating and highly debated philosophical question. It's true that our brains are capable of creating incredibly vivid experiences, even entirely fabricated ones. Think about dreams, for example. They feel real while we're in them, even though they're entirely generated by our minds.
And that raises the question, how do we know that our waking life isn't just another more elaborate dream? How can we be sure that our senses are actually reflecting an external reality and not just feeding us a carefully constructed illusion?
Ultimately, the only thing we can be truly certain of is our own consciousness. Everything else, including the existence of our senses and the world around us, could theoretically be a grand hallucination.
But I think it's important to differentiate between the two concepts we've been discussing. The first is the way our brains naturally interpret sensory information to create a model of reality. This is a scientific fact, and our senses play a crucial role in this process.
But the simulation hypothesis proposes something entirely different. It suggests that our entire reality, including our brains and senses, is a simulation created by some external entity. In this scenario, our senses wouldn't be reflecting an external reality. They would be part of the simulation itself.
So, in the first case, our senses are real and provide us with data about the world. In the second case, our senses are simply part of the simulated reality and may not be indicative of anything beyond the simulation itself.
If we entertain the idea that we are living in a simulated reality, it begs the question, can we change it? Can we somehow influence the simulation itself?
Some people believe that we can, to a certain extent. They argue that our consciousness has the power to affect the simulation, particularly when it comes to our individual experiences. However, there's also the concept of consensus reality, which suggests that the simulation is more resistant to change when multiple observers are involved.
So, it might be easier to alter the simulation when we're alone, as opposed to when we're surrounded by other people who are also contributing to the consensus reality.
For example, some believe that you might be able to change the color of a chair in your own perception, but it would be much harder to do so if someone else was looking at the chair with you. Their perception of the chair's color would contribute to the consensus reality, making it more difficult for your individual will to override it.
And it makes me wonder about those instances where people seem to know things about us that they shouldn't, or when we experience strange coincidences that defy logical explanation. Could these be signs that the simulation is somehow responding to our thoughts or intentions?
It's certainly possible. But it's important to remember that our brains are also incredibly complex and capable of generating all sorts of experiences, including seemingly impossible coincidences. Attributing everything to the simulation might be overlooking the power and potential of our own minds.
So, to clarify, when we talk about changing the simulation, we're really talking about changing our own individual perception of it, right? The chair example illustrates how our brains construct reality, and how that perception can be unique to each individual.
And while we can use drugs or other means to alter our brain chemistry and affect our perception, that doesn't necessarily mean we're changing the underlying reality itself. It's just our own internal simulation that's being modified.
Which brings us back to the bigger question. Is this all a simulation or not?
It's a difficult question to answer definitively. There's no concrete evidence to prove that we're living in a simulation, but there's also no way to conclusively disprove.
I guess it comes down to personal belief. Some people find the idea of a simulated reality comforting, while others find it unsettling.
But even if we are living in a simulation, that doesn't necessarily negate the reality of our experiences. Our emotions, our relationships, our struggles, they all still matter, regardless of the nature of the universe we exist in.
And perhaps the question of whether or not it's a simulation is ultimately less important than the question of how we choose to live our lives within it. The burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. However, when it comes to the simulation hypothesis, providing definitive evidence is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
We are limited by our own perception and the tools at our disposal. If we are indeed living in a simulation, it's likely designed in a way that prevents us from definitively proving its existence.
Some argue that certain aspects of our reality, such as the limitations of the speed of light, or the strange results of quantum mechanics experiments, could be hints that we're living in a simulation. But these are far from conclusive proofs.
And that's why many compare belief in the simulation hypothesis to religious faith. It requires a leap of faith to accept the possibility, as there is no concrete scientific evidence to support it.
While the simulation hypothesis is a fascinating thought experiment, it's important to acknowledge that it remains in the realm of speculation and philosophy, rather than established scientific fact. You know, there's another way to think about the simulation hypothesis that I find particularly interesting. What if, instead of being digital creations within a simulated world, we ourselves are the simulation? What if our collective consciousness, with all its individual experiences and perspectives, forms the very fabric of reality?
That's a fascinating concept. It suggests that reality is not a fixed construct, but rather a dynamic and ever-changing tapestry woven from the threads of our individual consciousnesses.
And it would explain why each of us experiences reality in a unique way. We're not simply passive observers in a predetermined world, but active participants shaping the simulation through our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
I've often wondered if there's a connection between our individual consciousness and the way the world seems to respond to us. A few years ago, I felt a distinct shift in my own perception. It was as if the people around me became less real, less vibrant, almost like NPCs in a video game.
I've had similar experiences, particularly in crowded places, where people seem to fade into the background, becoming more like background sprites than actual individuals.
But I've also noticed that this can change depending on my focus and interactions. People who share my interests or who I engage with deeply seem to regain their vibrancy and individuality.
That aligns with the idea that our consciousness shapes the simulation. Perhaps the people we don't interact with or pay attention to become less real in our own personal simulations, while those we connect with become more prominent and detailed.
And it makes me wonder if our dreams, which have become increasingly vivid and surreal for me, are somehow a glimpse into the deeper workings of the simulation.
I agree that the shift in perception you describe could be a natural part of human development. As we mature, we shed some of our childhood innocence and become more aware of the complexities and harsh realities of the world.
It's certainly a disillusioning experience. We realize that the world is not always a kind and just place, and that humans are capable of immense destruction and self-sabotage.
If this is indeed a simulation, it's hard not to wonder what the purpose of it might be. Are we being studied by some advanced species, like lab rats in a cage? Are they trying to understand our behavior, our capacity for both good and evil?
We like to think of ourselves as masters of our own destiny, but what if we're just pawns in someone else's game?
The truth is, we simply don't know. We have no way of knowing for sure who or what might be behind the simulation, or what their intentions might be.
And that's what makes it all so unsettling. We are left with speculation and uncertainty. We could be living in a simulated reality created by aliens, advanced AI, or even our own future selves. The possibilities are endless, and the lack of answers can be frustrating.
But perhaps the most important thing is to focus on what we can control. Regardless of the nature of our reality, we still have the power to choose how we live our lives, how we treat others, and what kind of impact we want to have on the world. I agree that the argument for the simulation hypothesis shouldn't rely solely on subjective experiences or personal beliefs. Just like the argument for the existence of God shouldn't be based solely on the beauty of the natural world, we need more concrete evidence to support the idea of a simulated reality.
However, the rapid advancements in virtual reality technology do make the possibilities seem more plausible. If we, with our limited technology, can create increasingly immersive virtual worlds, imagine what a civilization thousands or even millions of years ahead of us could achieve.
It's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. And while we may not have definitive proof, the sheer vastness of the universe and the limitations of our current understanding leave room for such mind-bending concepts.
I think it's important to approach this with an open mind and a critical eye. We can entertain the philosophical questions and explore the logic behind the simulation hypothesis without necessarily taking it as absolute truth.
And as you mentioned before, even if we are living in a simulation, it doesn't diminish the importance of our lives and experiences within this reality. we still have the responsibility to make choices, pursue our goals, and strive to make the world a better place. I completely understand your perspective. As scientists, we are trained to rely on evidence and verifiable facts. And while the simulation hypothesis is a fascinating thought experiment, it currently lacks the scientific grounding to be considered a true scientific theory.
However, that doesn't mean we should dismiss it entirely. As you said, using logic and conjecture, the possibility remains intriguing. And perhaps our current understanding of reality is simply limited by our current stage of evolution.
It's humbling to think that we might be like those early life forms without eyes, unable to perceive the full spectrum of reality. Who knows what incredible discoveries and paradigm shifts await us as our intelligence and technology continue to evolve.
And while it's important to separate speculation from established scientific fact, it's also important to remain open to new ideas and possibilities. After all, some of the greatest scientific breakthroughs started as seemingly outlandish ideas.
And while we should be cautious about drawing parallels between the simulation hypothesis and religious faith, there is a shared element of acknowledging the limitations of our current knowledge and embracing the vastness of the unknown. I think acknowledging the vastness of the unknown is a crucial step in our intellectual and scientific development. Recognizing that there's so much we don't know opens our minds to new possibilities and fuels our curiosity to explore further.
And while the simulation hypothesis may not be definitively proven, the rapid advancements in technology do make it seem increasingly plausible. It's not a stretch to imagine that civilizations far more advanced than ours could create incredibly sophisticated simulations.
However, it's important to remember that the simulation hypothesis is not the only explanation for the complexities and paradoxes of our existence. The universe itself is a vast and mysterious place, and there may be countless aspects of reality that we simply haven't discovered or understood yet.
But the simulation hypothesis offers a compelling framework for exploring these mysteries. Your idea about us being a program designed to solve Russell's paradox is particularly intriguing.
The paradox itself is quite complex, but, in essence, it deals with the concept of sets and whether a set can contain itself. Imagine a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Now, the question becomes, does this set contain itself? If it does, then it contradicts its own definition. But if it doesn't, then it should be included in the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, which means it does contain itself. It's a mind-bending paradox that highlights the limitations of our logical systems.
And your theory is that our simulated reality might be an attempt to solve this paradox, to find a way out of this logical conundrum?
Perhaps our existence within the simulation is generating data or insights that could help solve the paradox in the real world, whatever that may be. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, from the philosophical underpinnings of the simulation hypothesis to the potential implications of advanced technology, and even the complexities of Russell's paradox.
And while we may not have arrived at any definitive answers, I think the exploration itself has been valuable. It's important to question our assumptions, challenge our understanding of reality, and remain open to new possibilities.
And regardless of whether or not we are living in a simulation, the reality of our experiences and the choices we make remain significant. We still have the responsibility to live meaningful lives, connect with others, and strive to make the world a better place.
Perhaps the true value of the simulation hypothesis lies not in providing definitive answers, but in inspiring us to explore the vastness of the unknown and to appreciate the wonder and complexity of existence, simulated or not.